You're listening to Skate of Thrones, your go-to podcast for dialed-in LA Kings coverage.
Fans were saying it felt like a playoff-style atmosphere at Crypto.com Arena as the Kings take down the Golden Knights by a final score of 5-2. You're listening to Skate of Thrones, the podcast that dials in on the Los Angeles Kings. I'm your host, Casey Kasliner. As you heard that right, the Kings take down their rivals 5-2. Despite facing a 2-1 deficit at second intermission, the Kings score 4 in the third period, and the offense is just waking up at the right time. The Kings, of course, struggled immensely in January to put goals on the board, and in February, it's been a pretty different story, and the Kings now have won 5 of their last 6 games with the win over Vegas and cover critical ground in the Pacific. So we'll get into this game and more, and just a dominant win for the Kings. I mean, obviously, Vegas is a great team all around. They're a good team offensively and defensively. They have, a bit of a offensive edge on the Kings. Defensively, both teams are very strong. And one interesting note going into this game is obviously the Kings' power play is very weak. And it did score tonight. It did score in the last game against Utah as well. But the Knights have a very poor penalty kill, ranked 21st in the league going into today, but of course a good power play. And so the question was going to be, how were those two sides going to clash? And the Kings did score on the power play, their first goal. So that was one interesting thing to note. But just two teams that can defend well and counter well, and that's kind of what we've seen out of them in the Pacific Division. Of course, the 2 times they've played prior to this were high scoring. Of course, it was a split going into it with the Kings winning 1 and Vegas winning 1. But interesting game. I mean, it was a pretty typical lineup set. The Kings went with 11-7, Brandt Clarke as the 7th defenseman. But the Kings know that they can move stuff around with that lineup configuration. And so that was an interesting thing. I mean, we saw a really good line today of Darcy Kuemper, Quinton Byfield, and Kevin Fiala, and that really thrived well. And we kind of saw the untapped potential from that line. And you can give the win credit to a lot of different guys. I mean, Quinton Byfield with an absolutely incredible game. 4 assists. That's a career high for him. Assisted 4 of the 5 goals. Trevor Moore had 2 goals. We saw flashes of vintage Trevor Moore when he gets that wrist shot flanking up the left side and he just rips one quickly. I mean, he can really do a lot of damage, and we saw that from him last year. Haven't really seen that from him as much this year, but 2 goals for him, and I mean, he's a huge reason for the win. Kevin Fiala gets his 7th goal in the last 6 games. I mean, the Kings really knew how to run away with this game when they needed to, and it mattered. But yeah, that first goal from Trevor Moore, a great feed from Quinton Byfield to the slot, and Moore tips it in. And so that was really how things got started. The Kings did not play well in the second period. Braden McNabb, who's a former King, scored on them on a nice feed from Hurdle, and that evened up the game. And then Mark Stone caught a deflection, and that gave Vegas a 2-1 advantage. And so really the Kings did not really sustain that momentum that they had to in the second period, and as a result, they found themselves needing to come back. But as they've done all year at home, they played well in the third period. I mean, this home record is ridiculously good. Best in the NHL, 19-3-2. Vegas is also a good team at home, but the Kings have that 19-3-2 record. And so the Kings really struggled, and I want to go back to that second period because it was a weak spot for them. The Kings really struggled to break out of that forecheck. They were not playing simple in their O zone, and then when they would get back on D, they would have to deal with that just flanking Vegas offense. But the forecheck really kind of ruined the Kings' momentum. And, they didn't play simply. They overpassed a lot. And Trevor Moore talked about that in the press conference. But I think what really led to the Kings' success was versatility on the lines, being able to move stuff around with the 11-7. And then at the same time, the youth in this lineup. Obviously, the Kings, rely a lot on their veterans to get stuff going. Warren Fogle scored tonight. Obviously the catalyst in this game. You could point to some veterans and young guys, but the depth in this lineup that's sort of spearheaded by that youth really helped the Kings out. And so, yeah, Trevor Moore had the first 2 goals. Warren Fogle gets the third one, and that would made it 3-2, and the Kings wouldn't look back from there. Joel Edmondson had the next one, scoring from the point. And then Kevin Fiala had an amazing goal as well, increasing his nice play off of a feed from Kuemper, who was down low. But that Warren Fogle goal, I mean, that Quinton Byfield pass backhand perfectly into the slot for Fogle, who went backhand himself and scored. That was incredible. and it really got the building going. And Jim Hiller talked about it in the press conference. I mean, it's hard to attribute success to home in a way, right? It's all games at the same time. But when you're 19-3-2 at home, you know that something's working at Crypto.com Arena. And the Kings know, the fans are in it. It feels like a playoff-style atmosphere. I mean, this could be a playoff series, Kings in Vegas. It very well could be. And I'm sure the Kings would favor that over having to play Edmonton for the fourth year in a row. But now the Kings are just 3 points back of Edmonton for second in the Pacific and 5 points back of Vegas. And so, it should be an interesting final 25 games or so. And the Kings now in their last 2 games have outscored opponents 10-5. And so the offense is really waking up. Maybe just having that rest out of the Four Nations face-off did it for him. But Darcy Kuemper was also incredible. Had 21 saves tonight, allowed those 2 goals, now has 8 straight wins on home ice. And is looking like, obviously a great goalie, but, having that great defense in front of him helps too. And one interesting thing that, fans have been talking about and the media for a while is Brandt Clarke. Okay, so Brandt Clarke played 8 minutes tonight. He only played 5 minutes against Utah. We've seen his playing time go up and down this season. And I think it's an interesting debate. I think, Kings fans are very divided on this issue, right? There's some Kings fans who say, he is the best offensive defenseman on the team, which is true, of course, and he should be on the ice. They're a team that, has struggled offensively. And then there's other fans who are maybe a little bit more pessimistic about Brandt Clarke or want him to, develop more, that say, oh, it's building character. His ability to sit out kind of gives him the ability to, see what's going on. And at the same time, the Kings are winning. I mean, like I mentioned, they've won 5 of their last 6 games. They're, a very good hockey team. And they've done a lot of that without Brandt Clarke playing prime minutes. And I kind of agree with that sentiment if I'm going to weigh in. I think that, Brandt Clarke's a great player. He deserves to be, a top pairing guy in this league someday, especially with his offensive ability. He's versatile. His defense isn't, top tier per se for a defenseman, but he's 22 years old. And the Kings, of course, have Mikey Anderson and Vladislav Gavrikov on their top line, who are shutdown guys. And that's the identity of the team. It's not that Brandt Clarke isn't a good defenseman, but maybe he doesn't necessarily attend to the identity that the Kings are playing with. And does that mean he doesn't fit on the Kings and should be traded? No, absolutely not. I mean, they want versatility. Jordan Spence is, a pretty good offensive defenseman. He doesn't get tons of playing time right now, and it's the same thing. He's also young. I thought Jacob Muvarari tonight was also great. He was blocking a lot of shots. And that really pleased me from, the perspective of the Kings, containing a very offensively sound Vegas Golden Knights team. I want to circle back to Darcy Kuemper. Obviously a great goalie. I will say the 2 he allowed tonight were a little soft, especially the second one. It kind of just went through the 5-hole. Nothing to worry about, especially when you win 5-2, and only allowing 2 goals is not terrible. But I think Darcy Kuemper, has room to improve, and he's benefited from, having a great team in front of him. And he also made some really good saves, especially nearing the end of the first period. The Kings started to lose that momentum, and they would lose it going into that second period. But the Knights had plenty of good chances at the end of the first period, and Darcy Kuemper really shut it down like he needed to. Quinton Byfield talked in the press conference about the second period. It really motivated the Kings to go out in the third, check harder, turn defense into offense, just really create that connectivity that we've seen them have this season and not overthink things. And Trevor Moore spoke to this as well, but he talked about, when they overpass, they know they don't want to get a bad quality shot on net, but getting a shot on net is better than not. And the Kings have worked well around the rebounds as well this year, and they didn't really have to do that tonight. I mean, they just had some really clean goals that were contributed by good passes, and we saw that from Byfield. But at the end of the day, I mean, a win's a win, and you want to win against your divisional foes, and especially at this point in the season. The Kings will have another divisional foe coming to town on Wednesday, the Vancouver Canucks. Maybe not the strongest team this year as they were last year, but they made some trades prior to the Four Nations break. Vancouver's lost 2 in a row after having a 3-game win streak, but they're 0-2 out of the Four Nations break. Their offenses look pretty lackluster, so they'll come to town, and that's a big game for the Kings as well. I mean, I mentioned the point discrepancy at the top of the Pacific, but the Kings know their formula, right? It's you play good defense, you score 3 goals, you win a game. The Kings are 26-0-2 this season when scoring at least 3 goals in a game. It's a winning formula. The Kings are, interestingly, a statistically predictable team. When they play at home, they play well. When they score 3 goals, they're going to win games. It's not rocket science. But I think the Kings really just need to work on that middle frame, right? I mean, that second period was pretty unacceptable. It's not like they were just completely giving pucks away. They weren't playing terrible. And Kevin Fiala looked really good in that period. But the Vegas forecheck was just the big reason for it. And I mean, not every team is going to have a forecheck like Vegas, but you play those nights in the playoffs, you might have to deal with that. And in the 7-game series, I mean, this is a toss-up. I think Vegas is a really good team. They have that Stanley Cup winning experience from a couple years ago, and they're deep top to bottom. Not that the Kings aren't deep, but of course we've seen the offense dry up a little bit, and it did in that second period. Not that like they have to be scoring every period to be successful, but they allowed 2 goals, and they realistically weren't the best goals. I mean, Brayden McNabb is not a big goal scorer. The Mark Stone one was a deflection. So it is what it is. But I think really at the end of the day, the Kings should celebrate a win like this. There's plenty of games left, and the divisional race will change. However, you score 5 goals at home against Vegas. I just don't see really many issues in this game that the Kings had to suffer other than that second period. And Jim Hiller spoke to the team's sort of identity. He said they really didn't seem dangerous in this game. And I sort of was confused as to what he was referencing to, but I think really what he meant was the Kings at really no point besides the waning parts of that third period weren't really pushing Vegas on their back foot. The Kings were on their back foot a lot, having to deal with plenty of good rushes off the counter from Vegas, and Vegas is a very transition-heavy team, and the Kings, can operate that way as well, but they were pushed hard in their own zone and forechecked, and the Kings needed to push back, and they did so in the third period. And so Hiller himself said he doesn't want to look too far ahead. I mean, there's plenty of season left. He doesn't read into the standings yet, but playing at home helps, and they'll have a string of homestands left that I'm sure they'll be looking forward to. Another interesting thing is, speaking of Vegas, they'll play them twice more this year. That second matchup against Vegas will be the last regular season game for the Kings. And so that could be a really important game for standings. And so the fact that the Kings got the win tonight, they know what Vegas is all about. They played them now 3 times. They're 2-1. They've scored 6 and 5 goals respectively on the nights. I think they have to feel good about that matchup when it's all said and done, but you can never speak too soon. I want to just emphasize one more time that Fiala, Byfield, Kuemper line looks really good, creating so much opportunity, and Kevin Fiala has been heating up so much lately, started the season off slow. And Quinton Byfield, I mean, I think really the Kings have sort of summoned a version of him they didn't really know they had. And I think when they drafted him, obviously, they knew what he was capable of, but his ability to facilitate tonight, and he's done that a lot this month, hasn't really been like the goal-scoring guy you'd expect out of a number 2 pick. But for Quinton Byfield, his facilitation, his ability to look through the defense, send pucks through traffic, he did that on all the 4 goals he assisted on, and especially that Fogle one. And so that was really integral today for the Kings. And that third period, for the beginning of it, was pretty back and forth. And you thought really Vegas was maybe going to pull away and get that 2-goal advantage and run away with it. But the Kings knew how to respond, and they go out and get the win. So that's just going to do it for me here at Skate of Thrones. How fitting, a matchup between the Kings and Knights on Skate of Thrones. Couldn't have drawn it up any better. The Kings will host Vancouver on Wednesday, and so we'll be tuning into that. But thank you so much for listening, and have a good rest of your day.